Well, I'll be damned. Marcus Thompson stared at the small, lifeless body sprawled across Maple Street's cracked asphalt. A bobcat kitten, no bigger than a house cat, its distinctive tufted ears matted with blood. In 40 years of veterinary practice, he'd never seen one venture this close to town. His cell phone shattered the morning silence. "Marcus, we've got a situation." Dr. Sarah Bennett's voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. "Rabies outbreak. 3 confirmed cases in the wildlife population. We have 72 hours to locate and quarantine every bobcat in a 5-mile radius, or the state's ordering a complete cull." Marcus's weathered hands trembled as he knelt beside the kitten. Fresh tire tracks marked the pavement. "If we can't contain this, Marcus, they'll exterminate every wild animal in Evergreen Falls." His mind raced to Scout, the impossibly friendly bobcat that had been greeting neighbors for weeks. "Lord help me," Marcus whispered. "I think I know where they are." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Marcus's garage had become a makeshift command center. Glass vials clinked against each other as his shaking hands sorted through emergency veterinary supplies. Syringes, antibiotics, sedatives, everything he might need for what could be his final mission as a healer. The familiar weight of his leather medical bag felt heavier today, loaded with the gravity of what lay ahead. Evergreen Falls stretched below his hillside home like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. 3,200 souls nestled in the Colorado foothills, where manicured lawns bled seamlessly into wilderness. It was the kind of place where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone died, where kids rode bikes without helmets, where wild things occasionally wandered down from the mountains, seeking friendship instead of fear. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd retired 3 years ago after Eleanor's death, hanging up his stethoscope to escape the weight of constant life-and-death decisions. Yet here he stood, once again holding lives in his weathered hands. Through his kitchen window, he could see Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry on the line, completely unaware that death stalked the very forest that made their community so charming. Her grandchildren played in the backyard, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. Scout had first appeared exactly 1 week ago. Marcus remembered the moment clearly. He'd been replacing Eleanor's withered chrysanthemums when movement caught his eye. The young bobcat had emerged from the tree line with the casual confidence of a house cat, amber eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Instead of bolting at the sight of him, Scout had approached within 10 feet, sat on his haunches, and simply observed. That first encounter had lasted nearly an hour. Scout watching Marcus work in the garden, occasionally chirping soft vocalizations that sounded more like conversation than territorial warnings. When Marcus finally went inside, Scout had remained on the lawn for another 30 minutes before disappearing into the woods. Every morning since, Scout had returned. The pattern was always the same, emerging around dawn, spending time in Marcus's yard, accepting small offerings of leftover chicken, then vanishing by mid-morning. The neighbors had grown fond of their unusual visitor. Children pressed faces to windows, hoping to catch a glimpse. Even Joe Hendricks, the grumpiest man in 3 counties, had admitted the little fellow was kind of cute for a wild thing. But Marcus had noticed things others missed. The slight limp in Scout's left rear leg, the way his right eye occasionally clouded over, the tremor in his movements that could be youth or could be something far more sinister. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Bennett. "Mobile lab arriving at your location in 20 minutes. Time to see what we're really dealing with. Marcus closed his eyes and heard Eleanor's voice, clear as the day she'd spoken her last words. Take care of the ones who can't take care of themselves, Marcus. That's what we're here for. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same thing. The winter of 2022 had been the longest of Marcus Thompson's life. 6 months had passed since Eleanor's funeral, and the house still echoed with her absence. Coffee cups sat untouched on her side of the breakfast table. Her reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand, marking a page in a romance novel she'd never finish. Marcus moved through their home like a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions of living without feeling truly alive. It was during one of those gray February mornings, when the weight of grief pressed so heavily on his chest that breathing felt like work, that he'd seriously considered joining Eleanor. The thought came quietly, without drama, just a simple calculation that life without purpose might not be worth the effort. He'd been sitting in his truck in the hospital parking lot, staring at the bottle of sleeping pills Dr. Martinez had prescribed for his insomnia, when he heard it. A sound like a child crying, coming from the drainage ditch behind the medical complex. Marcus had found her there, a female bobcat, her beautiful spotted coat matted with blood and mud, one leg twisted at an angle that made his veterinarian's heart sink. She was conscious, but barely, golden eyes wide with pain and fear. Huddled against her body were 3 kittens, maybe 6 weeks old, mewing weakly for milk their mother was too injured to provide. Any reasonable person would have called animal control. Any law-abiding citizen would have reported the injured wildlife and let the proper authorities handle the situation. But Marcus Thompson, hollowed out by grief and desperate for something, anything to matter, had made a different choice. "Well, girl," he'd whispered, approaching slowly with his hands visible, "looks like we're both having a hell of a day." The bobcat, whom he'd eventually named Spirit for her fierce will to survive, had tried to growl to protect her babies even in her weakened state, but something in Marcus's voice, some quality born of shared suffering, seemed to reach her. When he gently lifted her onto a blanket in the back of his truck, she'd fixed him with those extraordinary amber eyes and seemed to make a decision to trust. Eleanor would have called it a sign from God. Marcus called it pure desperation on both their parts. The next 3 months had transformed his empty house into a secret wildlife rehabilitation center. He'd converted Eleanor's craft room into a makeshift veterinary clinic, complete with heating lamps, IV stands, and enough medical equipment to rival a small animal hospital. Spirit's leg required surgery, a delicate procedure Marcus performed on his dining room table, while the 3 kittens nursed from bottles he fed them every 2 hours. The legal implications terrified him. Treating wildlife without permits could result in federal charges, but watching Spirit slowly regain her strength, seeing the kittens grow fat and playful, feeling useful again after months of purposeless drifting, it was worth the risk. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Marcus had reason to get out of bed each morning. Spirit proved to be an extraordinary patient. Where most wild animals would have remained fearful and aggressive throughout their recovery, she seemed to understand that Marcus was trying to help. She tolerated his daily examinations, allowed him to clean her wounds, even purred when he spoke softly to her in the evenings. The kittens were equally remarkable. Bold, curious, and completely unafraid of their human caretaker. Eleanor always said animals are better judges of character than most people, Marcus had told Spirit one night as she watched him prepare their dinner. "Guess you're proving her right." It was during those long winter evenings, tending to his unlikely patients while snow fell outside, that Marcus began to feel Eleanor's presence again. Not the sharp, aching absence that had consumed him for months, but something warmer, her approval, her love, her gentle guidance from wherever she'd gone. She would have adored Spirit and the kittens. She would have stayed up all night bottle-feeding them, would have worried over every symptom, would have celebrated each small milestone in their recovery. The hardest part came in late May, when Spirit was fully healed and the kittens were old enough to survive on their own. Marcus knew he had to let them go. Keeping them would be selfish. They belonged in the wild, not in a grieving man's house. But the thought of losing them, of returning to the silence and emptiness nearly broke his resolve. He'd chosen a release site carefully, a remote area of the national forest where they'd be safe from roads and human interference. Spirit had seemed to sense what was happening as he loaded them into the transport carriers. She'd looked at him with those intelligent eyes and made a sound he'd never heard before, something between a purr and a trill that seemed to say, "Thank you." The actual release had been both heartbreaking and beautiful. Spirit had emerged from her carrier with regal dignity, immediately taking stock of their new surroundings. The kittens, now sleek young cats ready for independence, had bounded out with typical feline enthusiasm, racing through the undergrowth with joy at their newfound freedom. Marcus had watched them disappear into the forest, carrying with them a piece of his heart, but leaving behind something precious, the knowledge that he could still heal, still help, still matter. Eleanor's voice had seemed to whisper in the wind that day. "Every creature deserves a chance, Marcus, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones." Two of the kittens had vanished immediately into the deep woods, following their instincts toward territory and solitude. But the third, a male with distinctive markings and unusually bright amber eyes, had lingered at the forest edge. He'd looked back at Marcus with an expression so human, so knowing, that it had taken the old veterinarian's breath away. That kitten, Marcus was now certain, had grown up to become Scout. The realization hit him like a physical blow as he stood in his garage, preparing for what might be his final encounter with the Bobcat family he'd helped save. Scout wasn't just any wild animal seeking human contact. He was coming home. He remembered Marcus, remembered kindness, remembered safety. And if Scout was here, if he was healthy and strong and unafraid, it meant Spirit had done her job well. She'd raised her children to survive in the wild while somehow teaching them that not all humans were enemies. Dr. Bennett's white van pulled into his driveway, loaded with testing equipment and grim determination. Through his window, Marcus could see her checking her tablet, probably reviewing protocols for wildlife disease management. She was a good person, a dedicated professional who genuinely cared about animal welfare. But she was also bound by regulations, limited by bureaucracy, constrained by rules that didn't always account for the complex relationships that could develop between species. Marcus grabbed his medical bag and headed outside, his mind already working through possibilities. 72 hours to find Scout and determine if he posed a threat to the community. 72 hours to prove that trust and compassion could coexist with public safety. 72 hours to honor Eleanor's memory and Spirit's faith in human decency. As he watched Dr. Bennett unload her equipment, Marcus whispered a prayer to whatever forces had brought Scout back into his life. "Give me wisdom, Lord. Give me courage. And please, please let me be right about this." The clock was ticking, and somewhere in the Colorado wilderness, a young bobcat who'd learned to trust humans was about to discover whether that trust had been misplaced. The trail led Marcus deeper into the abandoned section of Evergreen Falls than he'd ventured in years. Condemned houses from the 1970s stood like broken teeth along overgrown streets, their windows dark and their foundations crumbling. This was where the town's expansion had stalled during the recession, leaving behind a ghost neighborhood that nature was slowly reclaiming. Perfect habitat for a bobcat seeking shelter close to human civilization. Marcus followed the subtle signs only a trained eye could spot. Compressed vegetation where a medium-sized predator had passed. The faint, musky scent that lingered in still air, scratch marks on fence posts at exactly the right height. Dr. Bennett had provided him with a tranquilizer gun and sampling kit, but Marcus hoped he wouldn't need either. If Scout truly remembered him, if the bond they'd formed 2 years ago still held meaning, then perhaps this could be resolved without force. The house at the end of Birch Street had been beautiful once. A split-level ranch with a wraparound porch, it had probably housed a young family with dreams of suburban happiness. Now its roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and neglect, and wild raspberry canes had claimed the front yard. Marcus approached carefully, noting fresh paw prints in the mud near the collapsed back deck. That's when he heard it, a soft chirping sound that made his heart skip. The same vocalization Scout had used as a greeting during those magical mornings in his garden. Marcus rounded the corner of the house and stopped breathing. Scout sat in a patch of afternoon sunlight, fuller and more magnificent than Marcus remembered. His coat had developed the rich, dense quality of full maturity, and his amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. But it wasn't Scout alone that stunned Marcus into stillness. Beside him sat another bobcat, smaller and more delicate, with the same distinctive markings but clouded eyes that spoke of blindness. "Hello, old friend," Marcus whispered, slowly lowering himself to sit on the ground 20 feet away. Scout's ears perked forward, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the two old acquaintances studied each other. Then Scout stood, approached to within arm's reach, and performed the same careful inspection he'd conducted years ago in Marcus's garden. The blind female, clearly his sister, remained alert but calm, trusting Scout's judgment about this strange human visitor. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes as Scout gently headbutted his extended hand, the same greeting behavior that had charmed Eleanor during those long-ago recovery days. The connection was immediate and profound. Scout remembered not just Marcus's scent or appearance, but the emotional safety he represented. "This is Hope, isn't it?" Marcus said softly, noting the female's confident posture despite her disability. "You've been taking care of her all this time." As if responding to his words, Scout moved to Hope's side and touched his nose to her ear, a gesture so tender it made Marcus's chest tight with emotion. Hope responded by leaning into her brother's warmth, a picture of absolute trust that spoke volumes about their relationship. Marcus began a careful visual examination of both animals, his professional eye cataloging every detail. Scout appeared healthy, good weight, clear eyes, steady breathing. But Hope concerned him. She was thinner than ideal, and when she turned her head, Marcus could see the telltale cloudiness of congenital cataracts. She'd been born blind, which meant Scout had been not just her protector but her lifeline, guiding her to food and water, warning her of dangers, ensuring her survival in a world where disabled predators rarely lived to maturity. The magnitude of Scout's devotion hit Marcus like a physical force. Most bobcats were solitary by 18 months. Brothers and sisters went their separate ways to establish individual territories. But Scout had chosen to remain with Hope, sacrificing his own independence to ensure his sister's survival. It was a decision that spoke to a depth of loyalty and love that transcended species. "You're heroes, both of you," Marcus murmured, slowly extracting his phone to document their condition with photographs. "But we've got a problem, friends. A big one." As if sensing the gravity in his voice, Scout moved closer, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert. Marcus noticed something else then. Scattered around their makeshift den were bones and fur remnants from various small animals. Rabbits, squirrels, even what looked like a young deer. All appeared to be healthy kills, no signs of the neurological damage that would indicate rabies in the prey animals. But it was what he found next that sent ice through his veins. Hidden beneath a collapsed section of deck was a pile of bones that told a different story. A raccoon skull showed the characteristic jaw fractures associated with rabies-induced seizures. Nearby, the remains of what had been a fox displayed the same disturbing signs: broken teeth from violent convulsions, bone fragments that suggested the animal had been thrashing uncontrollably before death. Marcus's hands shook as he photographed the evidence. Scout and Hope had been hunting in an area where diseased animals were present. The risk of exposure was significant, potentially catastrophic. He needed to get blood samples immediately, needed to know if either bobcat was carrying the virus. But as he reached for his sampling kit, Scout's behavior changed dramatically. The friendly greeting transformed into protective posturing as Scout positioned himself between Marcus and Hope, his body language clearly communicating, "You've seen what you came to see. Now leave us in peace." "I know, boy," Marcus said gently, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "I know you don't understand what's happening, but I need to help you just like before. Remember? Remember when I helped your mama?" At the mention of spirit, something shifted in Scout's amber eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the memory of old trust. Slowly, carefully, Scout relaxed his defensive stance, though he remained alert and ready to act if necessary. Marcus opened his kit and withdrew a small blood sampling device, essentially a large needle connected to a collection vial. In veterinary practice, it was routine. In the wild, with an unrestrained predator, it was potentially deadly for both species involved. "I need you to trust me one more time," Marcus whispered, extending the device where Scout could see and smell it. "Just like your mama did, just like Hope is trusting you right now." What happened next would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Scout looked at the needle, looked at Hope, then looked back at Marcus with those impossibly intelligent eyes. And then, as if he understood exactly what was being asked of him, Scout slowly approached and extended his front leg. The blood draw took less than 30 seconds. Scout remained perfectly still throughout the procedure, his gaze never leaving Marcus's face. When it was finished, he didn't retreat or show any signs of aggression. Instead, he moved to Hope's side and began the gentle guidance behavior that would lead her to extend her own leg for sampling. Hope's procedure was more challenging. She couldn't see what was happening and relied entirely on Scout's reassurance. But with her brother's nose touching her neck and his soft chirping in her ear, she too remained calm as Marcus collected the sample that might determine all their fates. As Marcus packed up his equipment, Scout approached one final time. This wasn't the friendly greeting of their earlier encounter or the protective vigilance during the blood draws. This was something else entirely, a communication that seemed to bridge the gap between species. Scout pressed his forehead against Marcus's hand and held the position for nearly a minute, amber eyes locked on weathered blue ones. The message was clear. "I remember you. I trust you. But if you betray that trust, if you bring harm to Hope, there will be consequences." Marcus nodded solemnly, accepting the weight of that promise. "I understand, son. I won't let you down." As he walked back through the abandoned neighborhood toward his truck, Marcus carried more than blood samples in his kit. He carried the hopes of two extraordinary animals who had chosen to trust a human in their darkest hour. In 68 hours, the state would begin its extermination program. In 68 hours, Scout and Hope would either be saved or become casualties of bureaucratic fear. Marcus started his engine and headed toward the laboratory that would determine their fate, praying to Eleanor's memory that love and loyalty would prove stronger than the virus that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. The fluorescent lights in Marcus's makeshift laboratory hummed with an intensity that matched his racing heartbeat. Midnight had come and gone, but sleep was impossible with blood samples cooling in his refrigerator and a deadline that felt like a noose tightening around his neck. 60 hours remained before the state's extermination teams would sweep through Evergreen Falls, and the preliminary test results staring back at him from his computer screen defied everything he thought he knew about rabies. Scout's blood work was a medical anomaly. The young bobcat tested negative for active rabies virus, but his antibody levels were astronomical, far higher than any vaccination could produce. Marcus ran the test 3 times, certain his equipment was malfunctioning, but the results remained consistent. Scout had been exposed to rabies, contracted the disease, and somehow survived. In 40 years of veterinary medicine, Marcus had never seen anything like it. Hope's results were terrifyingly different. The virus was present in her bloodstream, but at levels that suggested early infection, what veterinarians called the eclipse phase, when the disease was present but not yet symptomatic. She had perhaps 36 to 48 hours before the virus reached her brain and triggered the neurological symptoms that made rabies universally fatal. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of this revelation crushing down on him like a physical force. Scout hadn't just survived rabies, he'd developed natural immunity. But his sister was dying, and even with modern medical intervention, her chances of survival were virtually non-existent. No one had ever successfully treated symptomatic rabies in wildlife, but it was what happened next that changed everything. As Marcus studied Scout's blood work more carefully, searching for any clue that might explain the bobcat's miraculous immunity, a memory surfaced from the deepest recesses of his mind. Not a recent memory, something from decades ago, from his early days as a veterinarian when Eleanor was still alive and their world was full of possibility. He remembered a scarred little bobcat kitten, maybe 8 weeks old, brought to his clinic by a highway maintenance crew. The tiny creature had been hit by a car on Route 34, his left hip fractured, his right eye damaged, his small body broken, but his spirit blazing with an intensity that had captured both Marcus and Eleanor's hearts. They'd operated on their kitchen table because the emergency veterinary clinic was closed, working through the night to save a life that most people would have considered worthless. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through hundreds of photos until he found it. A picture Eleanor had taken during the kitten's recovery. A small bobcat with distinctive markings around his eyes and ears, sleeping peacefully in a basket beside their fireplace. The same markings he'd photographed today on a full-grown male protecting his blind sister in an abandoned house. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his hands shaking as the implications hit him. Scout. The bobcat he'd found today wasn't just any animal seeking human contact. It was the same kitten he and Eleanor had saved 10 years ago, the same tiny creature that had spent 3 weeks recovering in their home before being released back into the wild. Scout remembered him. More than remembered. Scout had recognized Marcus as someone who could be trusted in a crisis, someone who might be able to help Hope the same way he'd once helped a broken kitten on a rural highway. The intelligence required for that level of recognition and planning was staggering. Scout hadn't just stumbled upon Marcus's property during his regular rounds. He'd deliberately sought out the human who had saved his life years ago, gambling everything on the hope that Marcus would remember their connection and choose to help rather than report them to the authorities. Marcus pulled up the old medical records from that long-ago rescue, his heart pounding as the pieces clicked into place. The kitten had tested negative for rabies during his recovery. That was standard protocol for any wildlife brought to their clinic. But according to the notes Eleanor had meticulously kept, the highway crew had found him near a drainage culvert where several dead raccoons had been discovered, animals that later tested positive for rabies. The timeline was perfect. Scout had been exposed to rabies as a kitten during his most vulnerable weeks. But instead of succumbing to the disease, his young immune system had somehow mounted a successful defense, creating the antibodies that now protected him as an adult. It was a medical miracle that would have made headlines in veterinary journals if anyone had known to look for it. But the cruelest irony was that Scout's immunity couldn't save Hope. She needed immediate treatment with rabies immune globulin and post-exposure prophylaxis, expensive, specialized medications that were only available at major medical centers. Even if Marcus could get his hands on the drugs, administering them to a wild animal without proper facilities would be incredibly dangerous for both patient and practitioner. Marcus reached for his phone to call Dr. Bennett, then hesitated. What could he tell her? That he'd illegally sampled blood from 2 wild bobcats, that one of them was a patient he'd treated off the books a decade ago, that he needed access to experimental rabies treatments for an animal that state law required him to report for immediate euthanasia. Instead, he found himself dialing a different number. Dr. Maria Santos at the University of Colorado's Veterinary Research Facility. Maria had been Eleanor's student years ago, and she now headed one of the most advanced wildlife disease programs in the country. If anyone might have answers, it would be her. "Marcus?" Maria's sleepy voice answered on the 4th ring. "Do you know what time it is?" "Maria, I need your help with something that's going to sound impossible." Marcus took a deep breath and launched into the whole story. Scout's mysterious immunity, Hope's infection, the state's extermination order, and the 40 years of trust and love that had led to this moment. When he finished, silence stretched across the phone line for so long that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice now fully alert and filled with scientific excitement. "Marcus, what you're describing could revolutionize our understanding of rabies immunity. If this bobcat truly survived natural infection and developed protective antibodies, his blood could be the key to developing new treatments. But we need him alive to study his immune response." "What about Hope?" Marcus pressed. "Is there anything we can do for her?" Another pause, then, "Maybe. There's an experimental treatment protocol we've been developing using passive immunization, essentially transfusing antibodies from immune donors to infected patients. We've had some success with it in laboratory settings, but we've never tried it with wildlife in field conditions." Marcus felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time in hours. "What would you need?" "I'd need both animals here at the university within 12 hours. I'd need approval from the state wildlife department for experimental treatment. And Marcus, I'd need you to assist. You know these animals better than anyone, and they trust you. That trust could make the difference between success and failure." The weight of decision pressed down on Marcus like a mountain. Taking Scout and Hope to Denver would mean revealing everything: the illegal treatment from years ago, the unauthorized blood sampling, the violation of countless wildlife regulations. His veterinary license would be revoked. He might face criminal charges, but the alternative was watching Hope die and Scout lose the only family he had left. Marcus looked at the framed photograph of Eleanor on his desk, her gentle smile seeming to encourage him toward the choice she would have made without hesitation. "Every creature deserves a chance," she'd always said, "especially the broken ones." "I'll bring them to you," Marcus said quietly. "But Maria, if this goes wrong, if Hope doesn't make it, then we'll have tried everything humanly possible," Maria interrupted. "And maybe, just maybe, Scout's immunity will help us save the next Hope, and the one after that." As Marcus hung up the phone and began planning the most important journey of his life, he could swear he felt Eleanor's hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward a choice that honored not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of love that had brought him and Scout together across the years. 58 hours remained before the state's deadline. It was time to see if trust, courage, and 10 years of patient love could overcome a virus that had never been defeated. The transport carriers sat in Marcus's garage like twin monuments to hope and desperation. 48 hours remained before the state's extermination order would take effect, and Marcus found himself racing against time in a way that reminded him painfully of Eleanor's final weeks. Back then, he'd fought cancer with every tool modern medicine could provide. only to watch helplessly as the disease claimed the woman he'd loved for 37 years. Now he faced another enemy, invisible and just as merciless, threatening to destroy the extraordinary bond he'd discovered with Scout and Hope. Dr. Bennett had arrived at dawn with official paperwork and a grim expression. The mobile veterinary unit she'd brought looked more like a CDC containment facility than a rescue vehicle, complete with negative pressure systems and biohazard protocols that made Marcus's heart sink. This wasn't a rescue mission in her mind. It was a public health emergency that required swift, decisive action. "I've spoken with Dr. Santos at UC," Bennett said, reviewing her clipboard with bureaucratic efficiency. "She's agreed to take the animals for study, but Marcus, you need to understand what this means. Once they're in the university system, they become research subjects, not pets. If the experimental treatment fails, they'll be euthanized immediately for tissue analysis." Marcus nodded, knowing he had no choice but to accept terms that felt like a deal with the devil. "And if the treatment succeeds? Then we rewrite everything we know about rabies," Bennett replied. "But Marcus, you need to prepare yourself for the most likely outcome. Hope is already showing early symptoms, increased agitation, slight photophobia. We may already be too late." The journey to retrieve Scout and Hope felt like a funeral procession. Marcus drove slowly through the abandoned neighborhood, his mind cycling through memories of Eleanor that seemed to surface unbidden during moments of crisis. He remembered Christmas morning 3 years ago, when Eleanor had been too weak from chemotherapy to unwrap her presents. She'd sat in her favorite chair, wrapped in the quilt her grandmother had made, watching Marcus open gifts on her behalf. "Promise me something," she'd said that morning, her voice thin but determined. "When I'm gone, don't let the world make you hard. Keep saving the broken things, Marcus. It's what we're here for." At the time, he'd thought she was talking about animals. Now he wondered if she'd somehow foreseen this moment, when keeping that promise would require him to risk everything for 2 wild creatures who had chosen to trust a grieving human with their lives. Scout and Hope were waiting in the same spot where Marcus had left them, but Hope's condition had visibly deteriorated overnight. She lay in a patch of sunlight, her breathing rapid and shallow, while Scout maintained a protective vigil beside her. When Marcus approached, Scout's greeting lacked the enthusiastic recognition of their previous encounter. Instead, the young bobcat's amber eyes held something that looked disturbingly like accusation. "I know, boy," Marcus whispered, kneeling 10 feet away with the first transport carrier. "I know you're scared, but we're going to try to save her, just like we saved you all those years ago." The capture process required sedation. There was no safe way to transport 2 potentially infected wild animals without chemical restraint. Marcus prepared the dart gun with trembling hands, hating every moment of what felt like a betrayal. Scout watched the preparation with growing agitation, clearly understanding that something unpleasant was about to happen. When the first dart hit, Scout's reaction was one of pure heartbreak. His amber eyes found Marcus across the clearing, and for a moment that would haunt Marcus's dreams, the bobcat's expression conveyed such profound disappointment that it felt like a physical blow. Scout had trusted him, had brought him to Hope in desperate faith that Marcus would help rather than harm, and now he was experiencing the same betrayal that wild animals faced from humans throughout history. As the sedative took effect, Scout struggled to remain upright long enough to position himself between the approaching humans and his unconscious sister. Even as his legs began to fail, he maintained his protective stance, his body language clearly communicating that he would fight to his last breath for Hope's safety. "He's extraordinary," Dr. Bennett murmured, her professional detachment cracking slightly as she witnessed Scout's devotion. "I've never seen loyalty like this in a wild animal." "He's not just any wild animal," Marcus replied, carefully lifting Scout's sedated form into the carrier. "He's family." The drive to Denver stretched interminably, punctuated by Marcus's constant monitoring of the two carriers in his back seat. Both bobcats remained unconscious from the sedation, their breathing steady but labored. Hope's condition seemed to worsen with each mile, her body temperature fluctuating in ways that suggested the virus was beginning to affect her nervous system. Marcus found himself talking to Eleanor during the long stretches of highway, his voice barely audible over the truck's engine. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, honey. Maybe I should have just reported them from the beginning. Maybe I'm putting too many people at risk for two animals that might die anyway." But even as he voiced his doubts, Marcus remembered the moment when Scout had voluntarily extended his leg for the blood draw. That level of trust, that willingness to cooperate with a procedure that must have been frightening and painful, spoke to something deeper than mere animal instinct. Scout had made a conscious choice to believe in Marcus's good intentions, despite every evolutionary warning that told him to flee from human contact. Dr. Santos met them at the university's wildlife research facility, a state-of-the-art complex that looked more like a space station than a veterinary hospital. Her team moved with practiced efficiency, transferring both carriers to isolation units equipped with advanced life support systems. Within minutes, Scout and Hope were connected to monitors that tracked every vital sign, every fluctuation in their condition. "Hope's neurological function is declining faster than I'd hoped," Dr. Santos reported after her initial examination. "We need to begin the passive immunization protocol immediately if we're going to have any chance of success." The treatment required drawing significant amounts of blood from Scout to harvest his protective antibodies, then processing those antibodies into a serum that could be transfused into Hope. It was a delicate balance, taking enough blood to create an effective treatment while ensuring Scout's own health wasn't compromised by the procedure. Marcus watched through the observation window as Scout slowly awakened from sedation in his isolation unit. The bobcat's first action was to look around frantically for Hope, his distress evident even through the reinforced glass. When he spotted her in the adjacent unit connected to IV lines and monitoring equipment, Scout's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He began pacing the perimeter of his enclosure, calling to her with soft vocalizations that sounded almost like human crying. "He knows she's dying," Marcus said quietly. "He understands what's happening." Dr. Santos nodded, her expression grave. "Animals often comprehend more than we give them credit for. But Marcus, I need you to understand, what we're attempting has never been successful with rabies. The virus is simply too aggressive, too efficient at destroying neural tissue. Even if we can slow its progress, the damage may already be irreversible." As if responding to her words, Hope began showing signs of increased agitation in her unconscious state. Her body temperature spiked, her breathing became irregular, and the monitors tracking her brain activity showed the characteristic patterns associated with rabies encephalitis. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Hours, maybe less," Dr. Santos replied. "If we're going to try the experimental treatment, it has to be now." Marcus looked at Scout, still pacing desperately in his isolation unit, still calling to a sister who might not survive to hear his voice again. The young bobcat had already given so much, years of his life protecting Hope, his freedom to ensure her safety, his trust to enable this desperate rescue attempt. Now they were asking him to give his blood, literally offering his life force in the hope that it might save the only family he had left. "Do it," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Take whatever you need from Scout. If there's even a chance it might save Hope, we have to try." As Dr. Santos prepared for the most critical procedure of her career, Marcus pressed his hand against the glass separating him from Scout. The bobcat approached the window and placed his paw against the same spot, amber eyes locking with weathered blue ones in a moment of understanding that transcended species. "I'm sorry, son," Marcus whispered. "I'm sorry for everything we're putting you through. But I promise you this, whatever happens, you won't face it alone." Outside, darkness was falling over Denver, and somewhere in the Colorado mountains, government extermination teams were preparing for a dawn operation that would eliminate every wild bobcat in a 50-mile radius. Unless a miracle occurred in the next few hours, Scout and Hope would be the last of their kind in the region, two extraordinary souls whose only crime was trusting in the possibility of human compassion. The isolation ward at UC Denver's wildlife facility had never witnessed anything like the scene unfolding in the early hours of Thursday morning. Scout lay motionless on the surgical table, sedated for the third time in 24 hours, as Dr. Santos carefully drew what might be his final blood donation. His young body, already stressed from captivity and the trauma of separation from Hope, trembled even in unconsciousness. Marcus stood beside the table, one weathered hand resting gently on Scout's flank, feeling each labored breath as if it were his own. "That's all we can safely take," Dr. Santos announced, her voice tight with exhaustion and worry. "Any more and we risk sending him into shock." The blood processing equipment hummed in the background, separating Scout's plasma and concentrating the precious antibodies that represented Hope's only chance at survival. 18 hours remained before the state's extermination order would take effect, but Hope's condition suggested they had far less time than that. The rabies virus had begun its assault on her nervous system with devastating efficiency. In the adjacent unit, Hope lay unconscious and intubated, her small body convulsing intermittently as the disease attacked her brain tissue. The monitors surrounding her bed painted a grim picture. Elevated intracranial pressure, irregular heartbeat, temperature fluctuations that indicated widespread neural inflammation. Every alarm that sounded felt like another nail in her coffin. "Dr. Santos," the lead technician called from the blood processing station, "we've got a problem. The antibody concentration isn't as high as we'd hoped. Scout's immune response is incredible, but we're not getting enough volume to create an effective treatment dose." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. They'd put Scout through hell, drawn every drop of blood they safely could, and it still wasn't enough. Hope would die anyway, and Scout would wake up to find himself alone in a world that suddenly seemed designed to punish love and loyalty. "There has to be something else we can do," Marcus said desperately. "Some other treatment, some way to buy more time." "Marcus." Dr. Santos placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with the kind of compassion reserved for delivering impossible news. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen miracles that defied every medical principle I was taught. But sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite all the love and hope we pour into a situation, the outcome is beyond our control." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of his worst fears. He thought of Eleanor in her final days, how she'd squeezed his hand and whispered that some fights couldn't be won, no matter how fiercely they were fought. But this felt different. Hope wasn't elderly or weakened by years of illness. She was young, strong, with a brother who'd sacrificed everything to keep her alive. The injustice of it burned in Marcus's chest like acid. "No," he said quietly, then louder. "No, we don't give up. Not on her, not on Scout, not on what they mean to each other." Dr. Santos exchanged a glance with her team, the kind of look medical professionals shared when dealing with family members who couldn't accept reality. "Marcus, even if we had enough serum, the virus has already caused significant brain damage. The convulsions, the temperature spikes, these indicate massive neural tissue death. Even if Hope survived, she might never recover meaningful function." "You don't understand," Marcus replied, his voice rising with desperate intensity. Hope was born blind. She's lived her entire life adapting to challenges that would kill most animals. If any creature could survive brain damage and find a way to thrive, it would be her. Scout believes in her. I have to believe in her too. As if summoned by the sound of Marcus's voice, Scout began stirring on the surgical table. The sedation was wearing off faster than expected, his body's stress response accelerating his metabolism in ways that concerned the medical team. His amber eyes fluttered open, immediately seeking Hope's location despite his disorientation. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Scout, still groggy from anesthesia and weakened by blood loss, somehow found the strength to sit up on the surgical table. He looked at Hope through the glass partition, took in her condition with an intelligence that seemed almost human, then fixed his gaze on Marcus with an expression of such profound accusation that the old veterinarian felt his heart break. The message in those amber eyes was unmistakably clear. "You promised to help her. You said you could save her. I trusted you, and you failed us both." "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so goddamn sorry, son. I thought I could. I wanted to." Scout's response cut through Marcus's apology like a blade. The young bobcat turned away, dismissing the human who'd become the center of his universe, and began calling to Hope with soft vocalizations that sounded heartbreakingly like a funeral song. He was saying goodbye. Dr. Santos moved to sedate Scout again, but Marcus caught her arm. "Wait. Let him stay awake. If this is the end, he deserves to be with her. Marcus, he's lost too much blood." "He needs rest and fluid replacement. He needs to be with his sister," Marcus interrupted. "Would you want to be unconscious while someone you loved was dying?" The ethical implications of the request hung heavy in the air. Keeping Scout conscious while Hope died violated every protocol for animal welfare and research conduct. But the raw emotion in Marcus's voice, combined with the obvious depth of Scout's devotion, made the decision feel less clinical and more profoundly human. Dr. Santos nodded slowly. "We'll move him to Hope's unit, but Marcus will need to restrain him. He's too weak to move freely, and if he collapses—" "He won't collapse," Marcus said with sudden certainty. "Not while she needs him." The transfer took place with extraordinary care, Scout's weakened form supported by a specially designed harness that allowed him limited movement while preventing falls. When he was placed beside Hope's bed, his transformation was immediate and stunning. Despite his blood loss, despite his obvious exhaustion, Scout somehow found the strength to position himself protectively beside his sister. He began grooming her unconscious form with gentle, methodical strokes of his tongue, the same behavior he'd used to comfort her since kittenhood. Between grooming sessions, he would rest his head on her flank and make soft, purring sounds that seemed designed to ease her distress. The monitors showed that Hope's vital signs actually stabilized slightly in response to Scout's presence, her heart rate becoming more regular, her breathing less labored. "Extraordinary," Dr. Santos murmured, watching the interaction through the observation window. "He's providing therapeutic touch. I've seen it work with human patients, but never with wildlife." Marcus stood transfixed as Scout continued his vigil, understanding with crystalline clarity that he was witnessing something sacred. This wasn't just animal behavior, this was love in its purest form, unencumbered by human complications or selfish motivations. Scout wasn't grooming Hope because instinct told him to. He was saying goodbye because his heart told him she needed comfort in her final moments. But then, as dawn light began filtering through the facility's windows, something impossible happened. Hope's eyes fluttered open. Not the wild, unfocused gaze of rabies-induced delirium, but the clear, alert expression of consciousness returning. She was still blind, still desperately ill, but she was present in a way that defied every medical prediction Dr. Santos had made. Scout's response was immediate and profound. He pressed his forehead against Hope's and began making the soft chirping sounds that had been their private communication since childhood. Hope responded weakly but unmistakably, her head moving slightly to acknowledge her brother's presence. "Jesus Christ, Doctor," Santos breathed, checking Hope's neurological responses with growing amazement. "Her pupil response is improving. Her reflexes are returning. This shouldn't be possible." Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief and something that felt suspiciously like divine intervention. Eleanor always said miracles happen when love refuses to give up. But even as they celebrated Hope's unexpected awakening, the cruel reality of their situation remained unchanged. 17 hours until the extermination order took effect. 2 critically ill bobcats who couldn't be released into the wild. And a government bureaucracy that would view Scout's miraculous immunity not as a gift to be cherished, but as a research opportunity to be exploited. The hardest choice of Marcus's life was still ahead of him, and time was running out faster than Hope's fragile recovery could progress. Hope's miraculous awakening lasted exactly 47 minutes before the cruelest twist of fate Marcus had ever witnessed unfolded in the sterile confines of the UC Denver Wildlife Facility. Dr. Santos had been monitoring Hope's neurological responses with growing excitement, documenting what appeared to be an unprecedented recovery from symptomatic rabies, when her phone rang with news that would shatter everything they'd dared to hope for. "Dr. Santos, this is Director Harrison from the Colorado Department of Natural Resources." The voice on speakerphone carried the bureaucratic weight of absolute authority. "I'm calling to inform you that our timeline has been accelerated. We've received reports of 3 more rabies cases in wildlife populations across the Front Range. The extermination order is now effective immediately. We need those bobcats transferred to state custody within 6 hours for mandatory euthanasia and tissue analysis." The silence that followed felt like the pause between a lightning strike and thunder, a moment when the world holds its breath before devastation arrives. Marcus watched Scout's ears swivel toward the phone, the intelligent bobcat somehow understanding that the sounds carried threat, even if he couldn't comprehend the words. "Director Harrison," Dr. Santos replied carefully, "the female is showing signs of recovery that could revolutionize rabies treatment. If we could have just another 48 hours, Doctor, I'm not calling to negotiate. I'm informing you of a direct order from the governor's office. Public safety takes precedence over research opportunities. The animals will be collected at 3 p.m. today." Marcus felt something break inside his chest as he looked at Scout and Hope, the young bobcat still grooming his sister with tender devotion, unaware that a bureaucratic death sentence had just been pronounced over them both. Hope had beaten the odds, had somehow clawed her way back from the edge of death, only to face execution because human fear trumped scientific miracle. "There has to be another way," Marcus said desperately, stepping closer to the phone. "These animals pose no threat to public safety. They're contained. They're being monitored." "Who is this?" Director Harrison's voice sharpened with suspicion. Dr. Santos shot Marcus a warning look. "This is Dr. Marcus Thompson, a consulting veterinarian who's been assisting with the case. Dr. Thompson, I appreciate your concern, but the decision has been made at the highest levels. We cannot risk a rabies outbreak spreading into human populations. The animals will be euthanized according to state protocol." The line went dead, leaving them in a silence broken only by the soft sounds of Scout's continued ministrations to Hope. Marcus stared at the phone as if it were a loaded weapon that had just been pointed at his heart. 6 hours. That's all the time Scout and Hope had left. 6 hours to exist in a world that had decided their extraordinary bond meant nothing compared to statistical risk management. But as Marcus stood there, feeling helpless rage build in his chest, Dr. Santos was already moving with the focused intensity of someone who'd made a critical decision. She began pulling files from her computer, printing documents with rapid efficiency, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she accessed databases and contact lists. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked. "What Eleanor would have done," Dr. Santos replied, without looking up. "I'm calling in every favor I've accumulated in 20 years of wildlife research." There's a private sanctuary in Wyoming, Wild Rivers Preserve. They specialize in animals that can't be released but are too valuable to destroy. The director, Maria Chen, is an old friend who owes me for helping her get federal funding last year. Marcus felt a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. Can they take Scout and Hope? If I can get them there before the state collection team arrives. Dr. Santos's phone was already pressed to her ear. "Maria? It's Sarah Santos at UC Denver. I need a miracle, and I need it in the next 5 hours." The conversation that followed was conducted in the rapid-fire shorthand of professionals who understood that sometimes the most important work happened in the gray areas between legal and necessary. Maria Chen didn't hesitate when she heard about Scout's immunity and Hope's recovery. She immediately offered sanctuary space and promised to have her team ready for emergency transport. But the logistics were nightmarish. Wild Rivers Preserve was 400 miles away through mountain terrain that would be treacherous in late October weather. Both bobcats were still in fragile condition, Scout weakened by blood loss, Hope barely recovered from near death. Moving them would be risky under the best circumstances, potentially fatal given their current state. "We'll need a specialized transport vehicle," Dr. Santos said, already reaching for her keys. "Something with climate control and medical monitoring capabilities, and we'll need to leave within the hour if we want to stay ahead of the state team." Marcus looked at Scout and Hope through the observation window, the young bobcat now curled protectively around his sister as she dozed fitfully. The sight filled him with such profound tenderness that he had to grip the window frame to steady himself. These two extraordinary creatures had already endured so much: capture, sedation, medical procedures, separation from their natural habitat. Now they faced a harrowing journey into an uncertain future, all because humans had decided that potential risk outweighed demonstrated miracle. "I'm coming with you," Marcus said firmly. "Marcus, that's not necessary. My team can handle the transport." "It is necessary," Marcus interrupted. "Scout trusts me. If we're going to put him through another trauma, he needs someone familiar to help him stay calm. Besides," he added with a bitter smile, "I've already broken so many laws in the past week that adding interstate transport of quarantined wildlife seems almost trivial." Dr. Santos studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll take my research van. It's equipped with portable life support and monitoring equipment. But Marcus, you need to understand, if we're caught, this ends both our careers. The state won't just prosecute us for violating the quarantine order. They'll charge us with endangering public safety." "Eleanor always said some things are worth losing everything for," Marcus replied quietly. "I think she'd approve of this particular risk." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation that felt both urgent and surreal. Dr. Santos's team worked with practiced efficiency to prepare mobile medical units, while Marcus gathered supplies and made arrangements he hoped he'd never need. He called his lawyer, left detailed instructions for his estate, and wrote a letter explaining his actions in case the worst happened. But it was his final task that proved most difficult: calling Joe Hendricks to ask for a favor that could implicate his neighbor in federal crimes. "Joe, I need you to do something for me, and I can't explain why over the phone. Marcus, you sound like hell." "What's going on? If anyone comes looking for me in the next few days, government officials, wildlife officers, anyone in uniform, I need you to tell them you haven't seen me since Tuesday." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Marcus to wonder if Joe had hung up. Finally, his gruff neighbor's voice returned, softer than Marcus had ever heard it. "This about that bobcat you've been worried over?" "Among other things." "Eleanor ever tell you about my brother Danny, the one who died in Vietnam?" Marcus frowned at the apparent non sequitur. "No, she never mentioned. Danny was a medic. Got himself killed trying to save a wounded Viet Cong soldier when any sane person would have left the bastard to die. I spent 40 years thinking he was a fool for throwing his life away on an enemy." Joe's voice cracked slightly. "Took me until Eleanor's funeral to understand that maybe Danny knew something about being human that the rest of us forgot." "Joe, I don't understand. What I'm saying, Marcus, is that Eleanor saw something in you that reminded her of Danny. Something about not being able to walk away from things that are hurting, even when walking away would be safer." The old man cleared his throat roughly. "So whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, I haven't seen you since Tuesday, and that's the truth I'll tell anyone who asks." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes as he realized that even Joe Hendricks, the most practical and law-abiding man in Evergreen Falls, understood that some loyalties transcended legal obligations. "Thank you, Joe. That means more than you know. Just bring yourself home safe, Marcus. This town's lost enough good people already." As Marcus loaded the final supplies into Dr. Santos's van, he caught sight of Scout and Hope in their transport carriers, both conscious now and watching the activity with alert but trusting eyes. Scout's amber gaze found Marcus through the carrier's mesh front, and for a moment that felt suspended outside of time, the young bobcat seemed to communicate something that transcended species barriers. "I understand we're leaving. I don't know where we're going, but I trust you to take us somewhere safe." The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. In 3 hours, the state collection team would arrive to find empty isolation units. By evening, Marcus Thompson would be a fugitive from federal law enforcement, his life as a respected member of the Evergreen Falls community over forever. But as he climbed into the passenger seat of the van and docked, Santos started the engine, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death, the profound satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Santos asked as they pulled out of the university parking lot. Marcus looked back at the carriers holding Scout and Hope, then forward at the highway that would carry them toward an uncertain but hopeful future. "Eleanor always said the only way to honor the dead is to keep faith with the living," he replied. "I think it's time I started listening to her again." The highway to Wyoming had never seemed longer than it did on that October afternoon as Marcus watched the Colorado landscape roll past through the windshield of Dr. Santos's research van. Scout and Hope rode in specialized transport carriers behind them, both bobcats alert but calm, perhaps sensing that this journey was different from their earlier traumatic experiences. Every mile they traveled felt like a small victory against the bureaucratic machinery that had condemned them to death. The radio crackled with news reports about the expanded rabies outbreak, government officials assuring the public that aggressive measures were being taken to protect human safety. Marcus listened to his own transformation from respected veterinarian to dangerous fugitive being broadcast to thousands of Colorado residents who would never know the truth about Scout's miraculous immunity or Hope's impossible recovery. "No regrets, Doctor?" Santos asked as they crossed into Wyoming, her hand steady on the wheel despite the enormity of what they'd undertaken. Marcus considered the question seriously. In the span of a week, he'd lost his professional reputation, violated federal wildlife laws, and committed himself to a future he couldn't predict or control. But when he looked back at Scout's amber eyes watching him through the carrier mesh, he felt only profound peace. "Eleanor used to say that regret is what happens when you choose safety over love," Marcus replied. I think I've done enough choosing safety for one lifetime. Wild Rivers Preserve appeared through the afternoon haze like an answer to prayer. 10,000 acres of protected wilderness nestled between snow-capped peaks where animals who couldn't return to the wild could live with dignity and purpose. Maria Chen met them at the entrance with a team of veterinary technicians and the kind of no-questions-asked efficiency that marked someone who understood the difference between legal and right. "How are our patients?" she asked, immediately moving to examine Scout and Hope through their carriers. "Stronger than they should be," Dr. Santos replied. "Hope's neurological function continues to improve, and Scout's blood work shows he's recovering from the blood loss better than expected. But, Maria, there's something else you need to know about these two." As they transferred the carriers to the preserve's medical facility, Dr. Santos explained the full scope of Scout's intelligence and devotion, the years of caring for his blind sister, the deliberate seeking out of human help, the voluntary cooperation with medical procedures. Maria listened with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades working with wildlife, nodding at details that would have seemed impossible to most people. "Extraordinary," she murmured as they settled Scout and Hope into their new enclosure, a spacious habitat that mimicked their natural environment while providing security and medical access. "In 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never encountered anything quite like this level of interspecies trust." The moment Scout and Hope were released from their carriers, their behavior confirmed everything Dr. Santos had described. Despite being in yet another unfamiliar environment, Scout immediately began his protective routine, checking every corner of their new space before allowing Hope to explore. When she stumbled slightly on the unfamiliar terrain, Scout was instantly beside her, providing guidance with gentle touches and soft vocalizations. Marcus stood at the observation window, watching this ancient dance of love and loyalty, feeling his heart swell with emotions too complex for words. These two remarkable creatures had survived rabies, human bureaucracy, and a harrowing journey across state lines. They were safe now, protected by people who understood their value beyond any government risk assessment. But it was what happened next that would become the defining moment of Marcus's new life. Scout, after ensuring Hope was comfortable in their new surroundings, approached the observation window and placed his paw against the glass exactly where Marcus stood. Their eyes met through the barrier, and Marcus felt the same profound connection he'd experienced during their first encounter years ago in his garden. But this time, Scout's expression carried something new, not just recognition or trust, but gratitude so pure it took Marcus's breath away. "He's thanking you," Maria said softly, having witnessed countless such moments between animals and their human advocates. "He understands what you sacrificed for them." 3 months later, Marcus received word that the federal charges against him had been quietly dropped. Dr. Santos's research on Scout's immunity had attracted international attention, leading to breakthrough studies that could eventually save thousands of human lives. Government officials, faced with the undeniable scientific value of Scout's condition, had decided that prosecuting the people who'd preserved this medical miracle would create more problems than it solved. But Marcus barely registered the legal vindication. He was too busy with his new life as Wild Rivers Preserve's volunteer education coordinator, sharing Scout and Hope's story with visitors who came from around the world to witness the extraordinary bond between the two bobcats. Hope had not only recovered completely from her rabies infection, but had given birth to 2 healthy kittens, ensuring that Scout's bloodline and his remarkable immunity would continue. Marcus had sold his house in Evergreen Falls and moved to a small cabin on the preserve grounds where he could see Scout and Hope's habitat from his kitchen window. Every morning, he watched Scout's routine of checking on Hope and the kittens, marveling at how parenthood had added new dimensions to the young bobcat's already impressive capacity for love. The visitors who came to hear their story often asked Marcus about the cost of his choices, the career lost, the home abandoned, the comfortable retirement sacrificed for two wild animals. His answer had become something of a legend among wildlife advocates across the region. My wife Eleanor always said we're not measured by what we accumulate in life, but by what we're willing to give up for love, Marcus would tell them, his weathered hands gesturing toward Scout's habitat. Those two taught me that family isn't just about blood or species. It's about showing up when the world says nobody's coming. It's about choosing courage over comfort, hope over fear. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit on his cabin porch and watch Scout teaching Hope's kittens to hunt and play, their antics a joyful reminder of life's resilience. Sometimes Scout would notice Marcus watching and approach the habitat fence, amber eyes bright with the same intelligence that had first captivated a grieving veterinarian years ago. In those moments, Marcus felt Eleanor's presence most strongly, not as a painful absence, but as a warm approval of the path her teachings had led him down. She'd been right about so many things, that broken creatures often heal each other, that love transcends the boundaries humans create, that sometimes the most important work happens when nobody's watching. The preserve's guest book filled with comments from visitors who'd been moved by Scout and Hope's story, but it was a note from a young girl that Marcus treasured most. Dear Mr. Marcus, my mom says you gave up everything to save Scout and Hope. But I think Scout and Hope saved you too. Love, Emma, age 8. 8-year-old Emma had understood something that escaped most adults, that salvation is rarely a one-way transaction. Scout and Hope had given Marcus purpose when he'd lost his way, family when he'd been alone, and proof that love really could conquer the forces that tried to tear it apart. As winter settled over the Wyoming mountains and Scout and Hope prepared for their second season as parents, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived according to Eleanor's principles. He'd learned that the most important laws weren't written in government books, but encoded in the heart. Laws that demanded compassion for the vulnerable, courage in the face of injustice, and faith that love would always find a way. In Evergreen Falls, Joe Hendricks still tended Marcus's former garden, leaving it ready for a return that both men knew would never come. But sometimes, when the mountain wind carried stories from Wyoming about an old veterinarian and his bobcat family, Joe would smile and remember Eleanor's words about taking care of the ones who couldn't take care of themselves. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Marcus would listen to the sounds of the preserve settling into night, the soft calls of Scout and Hope to their kittens, the rustle of wind through evergreen branches, the gentle creek that ran past his cabin, and know with absolute certainty that he was exactly where Eleanor had always meant for him to be. Some love stories, Marcus had learned, don't end with the traditional markers of human happiness. Sometimes they end with the deeper satisfaction of promises kept, sacrifices honored, and trust rewarded across the seemingly impossible distances between species. Sometimes they end with the knowledge that when the world demanded choosing between safety and love, you chose love every single time. And sometimes, late at night when the mountain stars blazed overhead, Marcus could swear he heard Eleanor's gentle voice carried on the wind, "Well done, my love." Well done. In a world that often tells us our best years are behind us, Scout and Hope's story reminds us of a profound truth. It's never too late to discover your most important purpose. Marcus Thompson was 68 when he made the choice that defined his legacy, not the comfortable retirement he'd planned, but a courageous stand for love over safety. Like many of us in our golden years, Marcus had lost his life partner and felt adrift, questioning whether his remaining years held any real meaning. But when Scout appeared in his garden, carrying the weight of caring for his blind sister, Marcus recognized something powerful. Sometimes our greatest calling comes disguised as someone else's desperate need. Eleanor's wisdom echoes through their story. We're not measured by what we accumulate, but by what we're willing to give up for love. In our 50s, 60s, and beyond, we face the same choice Marcus did: retreat into comfortable isolation or step forward into uncertain purpose. Scout's unwavering devotion to hope, Marcus's sacrifice for both of them, proves that the deepest happiness doesn't come from preserving what we have, but from discovering what we're still capable of becoming. What in your life are you most grateful for, even if it required sacrifice? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in helping someone who couldn't help themselves? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how love has transformed your later years.